Hello and welcome back to game number 8 of what is our new series, The Masters of the Chessboard, where we're going through the famous Richard Reti's book, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of his games one at a time and looking at his analysis of each of these games. In this game, we are still continuing with poor Morphy's games, and Morphy has the white pieces in this game, and his opponent has the black pieces. Now, in the book, his opponent is simply titled Amateur, and this game was taken, according to the book, from a Blindfold exhibition in a Simultaneous exhibition, even in New Orleans in 1858. The game starts with e4, e5, knight f3, attacking the pawn, knight c6, defending the pawn, and bishop to c4. So we have an Italian game on the board. Now, so far we've only really looked at the Scotch game and the King's Gambit. But now we have the Italian game on the board. And Reti offers a bit of analysis to this opening as well, except he's really quite critical of the Italian game, actually. He says that White plays bishop c4, furthering their development, but it's not really clear what White's intentions are. It's not really clear how White intends to open up the game, whether they're going to play d4 or whether they're going to castle and, with some extra preparation, play f4 to try and open the game up. And Reti says that in light of the modern chess theory, or at least a theory that was modern back then, after e4, e5, Black's e5 pawn is fairly immovable and should be the natural focal point of the attack in the opening. And therefore, White should be really trying to open up the game with d4 or f4, and his moves should be to that end. And only by trying to play for d4 or f4 can White really take advantage of the fact that they have the first move of the game. And indeed, after knight f3, White is already attacking this pawn, and knight c6 is already defending this pawn. And so really the best response after knight c6 is either d4, which we've seen, or bishop b5, going into the Ruy Lopez. And he says that because bishop c4 doesn't really constitute towards the attack on this pawn, this just isn't really seen in modern tournament play. At least it wasn't during Reti's time, and it's still not seen that often at the highest level. But I think we all know that the Italian game is still a respectable opening, even if its theory has been explored to the bitter end. Now here he says that Black has a few options. The strongest is knight f6, which attacks this pawn and therefore gives Black the initiative. Less certain is bishop c5, going into the gioco piano. This is an attempt to present d4 according to Reti, but it only really prevents d4 for a short time. There is another alternative, which is bishop e7 going into the Hungarian defense, but as Reti quite rightly analyzes, this just gives White all the initiative. The initiative is fully in White's hands after bishop e7. The black player here plays bishop to c5, going into the gioco piano. And now we have the legendary Evans Gambit. It's what this channel is named after this opening, mainly because my name is Evan, but also because it is a fantastic opening. I love this opening. And I know Agamator would be very proud to see this opening. And here Reti comments that b4 is an attempt by White to take the lead by trying to exploit the positioning of this bishop on c5. White's aim is to play c4 followed by d4. And White's aim here will be potentially to play c3 followed by d4. However, after Black accepts this pawn sacrifice, White can play c3 d4 with a tempo. Now, the black player here accepts the pawn on b4, but Reti does comment that the Evans gambit can be declined with bishop to b6. And in this case, the advanced pawn on b4 can be quite weak, and the bishop on b6 is still quite good. It's almost just as effective as it was on c5. It still controls this long diagonal. And Reti comments that for this reason alone, the Evans gambit is not really very good. It's not really recommended. But we see bishop takes b4, and then c3. Now bishop to a5. And Reti comments that bishop to a5 is the better move compared to bishop to c5, because after bishop to c5, the bishop will be immediately under attack after d4. Morphy responds, d4, continuing in true gambit style. The only real alternative to d4 would perhaps be to castle. We see d4, and here Reti comments that it's White's intention to force black to make a decision as to whether they are going to try and leave White with a very strong center, or to try and win more pawns. And black spending a few moves winning these pawns would mean that whilst black would have material advantage, White would have a very strong lead in development, and White's development would give them a temporary material advantage. The black player here chooses to accept the pawn sacrifice. An alternative, if they didn't want to accept it, would perhaps be d6, which could potentially lead to some simplifications if White were to take here, because after this exchange, black is the one playing for a win here. White's pawn structure here at the queen side is weakened, and black is also just simply up a clean pawn. But we don't see that. The black player instead takes. Morphy castles, and then we see d takes c3, and then bishop to a3. Now, Reti says that White's advantage in development probably doesn't compensate for the loss of the pawns. White is down 3 pawns, although this pawn would be... Black's not going to be able to hold on to this pawn. It's almost certainly going to be taken. But Reti also says that instead of bishop to a3, queen b3 would perhaps be better at attacking this pawn, which would force the black queen to f6, enabling White to attack it with e5. However, with this bishop a3 move, the black player can potentially defend the f7 pawn if needed with knight to h6, which is what we see in the game. So black replies with d6, and queen to b3 attacking this pawn. Knight to h6 defending the pawn, and then we see knight takes c3, recapturing the pawn and developing. And White's got quite a good amount of development here. Black exchanges on c3, and here Reti comments that this exchange allows White to develop a very aggressive formation of his pieces. Black castles, and White plays rook a to d1. Now, Reti comments that White has a lead in development, and in order to use this development lead to his advantage, White must try and open up the game as much as possible. And therefore, the best move that White can try and play for is e5 to open up several files. And therefore, Black wants to try and stop this move, and he does this with knight g4, hoping to bring the knight to e5. Morphy kicks it away, and he plays knight to e5. We see knight takes e5, knight takes e5, and this bishop is under attack, and Morphy doesn't want to exchange it off. the more pieces that get exchanged, the safer Black's king will be, and the more of an advantage Black will have. See bishop to e2 here. Reti comments that in the instance of bishop to b3, Black could play bishop to e6, seeking some simplifications. But instead, we have bishop to e2 on the board. And here, Reti comments that White now wants to try and open up the game, and they hope to do this with the f4 pawn break. Now, Reti comments that Black's next move is a mistake, and quite an instructive mistake. White has got a strong lead in a development, and so Black should really be trying to keep the game as close as possible. Reti offers the moves c6 and knight to g6, hoping to try and defend this e5 pawn break. But instead, we have f5 played, and Reti comments that this move was probably an attempt by Black to try and free up Black's position and to try and get Black's own pieces to more favourable squares. However, the Black player solves Morphy's problems for him. Morphy wants to open up the game, and Black does that for him. And Reti comments that this move not only opens up the game, but it opens several files and diagonals. After the pawns are exchanged, it opens the e file. It also opens the a2 to g8 diagonal, and the a1 to h8 diagonal is now open because there's no longer an f6 possible push here. And after the next few moves, it's move 15 now, so Morphy is going to play the 16th move. On the 17th, 18th, and 19th move, Morphy will take possession of all three of these open files, all three of these open lines, one after another with tempos. Plays f4, forcing a knight move back to c6. Now I see bishop to c4, taking one diagonal with a tempo, king to h8, bishop to b2, taking the other diagonal with a tempo, threatening mate, so queen to e7, and now rook d to e8, taking control of the e file, which Morphy intends to open up with this e takes f5. The Black player responds with rook to f6, likely trying to block this diagonal. Morphy exchanges on f5, opening up the attack on the queen, opening up the e file. Now queen f8, and with this move, Reti comments that Morphy is now able to sees a chance to get some very decisive action to essentially end the game right here with a fairly brilliant combination. He plays rook to e8. Black has no choice but to accept the rook because the queen is pinned to the king. And then Morphy takes the rook on f6. So we've essentially exchanged rooks. It's worth noting g takes f6 isn't possible because bishop takes f6 is mate. And now here, the Black player mate is still being threatened with the queen, and the Black player plays queen to e7, hoping for a queen trade and also defending the g7 focal point. But here, Morphy comes up with an even more ingenious move. Queen takes g7. Queen takes g7 and f6. Now in the game, the Black player took on g2, which was, as Reti described, just sheer desperation. But let's look at the alternative. The alternative variation which Reti gives is queen to f8. And this is followed up with f7 check, knight e5, blocking the check, f takes e5, And now here, Reti gives h5, but that actually leads to a mate in 6, which we can look at first perhaps. h5, e6 check, king to h7. We see bishop to d3 check, king to h6, rook to f6 check, king to g6. Let's see, rook to g6 check, king to f4, and now king to f2, a nice quiet move. But we see the king is defending the 3 squares there, the bishop is defending these 2 squares, this bishop is defending this square, and the rook is defending all of these squares. And now g3 is essentially unstoppable, except for h4. So if black does nothing, we will see g3 mate. If black pushes the h-pawn, stopping g3, we'll see rook to g4 mate. So that's what would happen if queen f8 and we follow the line given in the book with h5. Instead, if black tried to run away with the king with g7, we would still see e6 check, king h6, king g6 is forced mate in 9, so king h6 is the only move, and e7. Now queen takes e7, f8 queen, queen takes, rook takes. And this is the end of the computer line, but it's fairly clear how Morphy is just going to very easily win this game. Black hasn't even developed these 2 pieces yet. And in fact, one of the computer's best moves is to simply sacrifice his bishop on h3, which you know is not going well when you have to do that. But we never saw queen f8 in the game. We saw queen takes g2 check, which, as Reti describes, was sheer desperation. King takes g2, and bishop takes h3 check, which I believe was to open up the rook to defend on the back rank. King takes h3, and then h5, hoping to give the king a bit of an escape square. But after rook g1, the black player resigns regardless. So what's being threatened here? Well, if we continue with the computer line, mate in 7 is forced, and the computer gives mate in 7 as knight e5. Quite a hard move to find that. After f7, h4, f takes e5, the computer gives d5 here, because after e6 you can block with d4, just delaying the inevitable, even that one move more. Bishop takes d4, king h7, bishop to d3 check, king h3, bishop to g7 check, king h5, and bishop to e2 mate. So that's the line the computer gives from here, but even here it's fairly clear the black king is on its own, the bishops are dominating the board, the pawn is very likely going to be able to get to f8, worst case scenario it will get to f8, although I have a feeling no matter what black plays, Morphy would find the mate pretty quickly here. And there we have it. Game number 8 completed, and I think we only have one more game after this. I think there's only 9 Morphy games. After that, we're going to be looking at the first world champion Wilhelm Steinitz, which I'm quite excited for. Actually, I haven't looked at many of Steinitz's games. So, without further ado, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I would really appreciate it if you could like, comment, and subscribe. And please comment if you have any feedback on the video or if you have any requests for future videos. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.